JMR Auto provides excellent automotive services, including state inspections, brakes, timing belts, oil changes, just to name a few. Services also include summer maintenance and winterization, specializing in both foreign and domestic vehicles. JMR Auto, located at 13235 Spotswood Trail, Ruckersville. Phone number 434-985-9850. That's 434-985-9850.
And welcome back to In My Humble Opinion with Charles Lewis and Maxilia Robinson, as always, on 101 Jams, the People's Station. And so joining us right now, it gives me great pleasure to have in studio with us a gentleman here to talk a little politics with us, but talk from a perspective that a lot of us may not be too familiar with, and so that's why it is such a joy and a privilege to have him here right now. We have Mr. Sidney Smith, and he is the co-chair of the Green Party of Virginia and also a delegate for the Green Party of Virginia. How are you today, sir?
I am very fine and very honored that you've asked me to come. I'm really delighted to be able to speak to you and to your listeners today.
Thank you. And so to start, again, you and I briefly chatted about the fact that a lot of voters aren't aware of the options besides the main two, the major two. So I wanted you to expound on that to give them your option.
Well, it's interesting that there have always been independent parties throughout American history, but particularly during our lifetimes, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have so dominated the political discussion that people have just sort of internalized the notion that somehow that's how it's supposed to be, as though there were Democrats or Republicans back in the beginning, or as though it were somehow written into the Constitution. But of course, that's not the case at all. In fact, the founders who wrote the Constitution were kind of hoping there wouldn't be any political parties. That was what they were aiming for. Obviously, that didn't work out. That ended almost immediately. But because of this dominance by these two major parties who now you know how it works. When people are in power, then other people want to cooperate with that power. So media and newspapers and business leaders and labor leaders have all sort of oriented themselves toward this notion that you've just got these two political parties. And that's a real problem now, because over the years, each of them has been trying to capture the center, and what they've done is sort of morphed into one another in many important respects. So that now politically what's most important in the United States is not the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, it's the similarities. It's the things they agree on that really ought to be drawing our attention.
So let me ask you a question about that. From your point of view, or you're speaking for your party's point of view, of course, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because our evolution kind of caused us to sort of simplify and just split into two factions, or do you think it was more money driven as far as one power and another power kind of trying to consolidate, or like why do you think that we got to a two-party system exactly?
Well, part of it is structural. The way our politics works for executive offices, it's what's called first past the post. It's whoever gets the most votes is the winner. And that's very different from a lot of democratic systems around the world where you have proportional representation. So just to take an example, there was just, as you know, a big upset in Great Britain over their vote to leave the European Union.
Right.
And a lot of people were shocked here when their prime minister resigned. It's like, oh, you mean if a leader makes a mistake, they resign? That's a novel idea. We don't do that in the United States, do we? But now there's a new prime minister, and how did that happen? They didn't have an election. Well, because back when they did have an election, their parliament got divided up proportionally among all these different political parties, including, by the way, the Green Party in England. And so this proportional representation allows all these different points of view to have a voice in government. And the way our government was designed way back in the 18th century, it's much, much harder to do that. And this is one of the things that the Green Party aims to fix. And there are ways to address that within our constitutional system, and we'd like to see that happen. Instant runoff voting is one of the most important.
Okay.
I just have a question for you with regard to the similarities that you mentioned between the Democratic and Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just kind of explain why that's important? I may be jumping the gun here into what was coming, what you were going to say next, but could you kind of elaborate on that?
I think the most important thing to understand about the Republican and Democratic parties is that now, and for the last, throughout our lifetimes, each of them is equally a party of war and Wall Street. Both of them are essentially funded and in bed with Wall Street and the big banks. Trump may be a little less so. He's a little bit of a maverick, but certainly his party, and absolutely if you look at the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton is in lockstep with Goldman Sachs and the Obama administration. The first thing he did was to hire Larry Summers, and so the big banks really are the power players. They are the ones who call the shots in both those political parties, and both political parties are committed to a militarist foreign policy that has us spending 10 times as much on our military. And let me kind of unwrap that a little bit. If you take the amount we spend on our military, it is more than the next 10 countries combined in terms of how much they spend on military, and most of those are our allies. So the United States is profoundly committed to a war posture and has been for a very long time. Right now we're still fighting the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, and both parties are equally committed to that. So those are the two big similarities that simply don't get talked about, because how are you going to talk about them? The Republicans and Democrats agree about them, so there's nothing to say if all you think is that we got to have a Democrat or a Republican.
So then, Sidney, how do you respond then to the voter who says, well, we got to be tough on defense and we have to, be the world police, is one term that's used, or those who say, as long as we regulate the banks, then then we can control this thing and we can still share, with the common man. What's your response to that?
Well, the banks are happy to be regulated, provided they get to write the regulations, and that's exactly what we've seen, right? If we're going to regulate the banks, we want somebody who's not the banks doing the regulation writing, don't we? I mean, you don't want the fox in charge of the hen house. But since the banks own both big political parties, that's never going to happen. So yeah, the big banks should be regulated, but it won't happen under the Democrats and the Republicans. What led directly to the great economic crash in 2008, 2009 was Bill Clinton's conniving with the Republican-led Congress to deregulate the banks and repeal Glass-Steagall, which had been in place since the Great Depression, precisely so as to prevent what actually happened in 2008, 2009. So, and Hillary Clinton, of course, is no different in terms of her relationship with the big banks. So we actually need to do a number of things, and this is part of the Green Party platform, and it's very easy. There's some lovely bullet points if you go to Jill2016.com, and Jill Stein is our presumptive nominee. Her platform is very straightforward. We need to bring back public banking. Do you know that until the it was at least up until the 60s, you could go down to the post office and open a bank account, and that was where you kept your savings, and that was where you cashed your checks, and it didn't cost you much, and they paid interest on your loans. It's still that way in most of the world. More than 90% of the developed world has public banking through the post office. But of course, we got rid of it in the United States, and now we have predatory payday lenders who are owned by, guess who? Those same great big banks. Yeah. So we need to break them up. We need to bring back public banking. We need to make it possible for people to conduct their business without paying usurious interest rates. And neither the Republicans nor the Democrats are even going to talk about doing that. Simply not on their radar.
Now, and what about the political process, the actual worth of the vote, though? For the person who says, well, I'll just find which candidate shares the most values with the Green Party because I don't want to waste my vote on the Green Party.
Sure. And there's a couple of things to say about that. One of them is a lot of people think of the Green Party. Actually, there's a lot of confusion about the Green Party anyway. A lot of us think that we're like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace, right? And both got green in them, right? It's about ecology. But those aren't political parties. Those are activist groups. They're advocacy groups. They're non-governmental organizations. They're doing very important work, but they're not political parties. A political party has one job, and that's to run candidates and to affect public policy. And so that's what we do. Now, The other big confusion is to think of us as being somehow, on this scale of left to right, where you've got the Republicans on the right, and maybe you've got libertarians even further to the right, although that's
Yeah.
debatable, and you've got Democrats supposedly on the left, and then the Green Party over to the left of the Democrats, right? But this whole left-right thing doesn't even apply to most of the issues that we need to address. The Green Party is not a lefter party of the Democrats in the sense of being, the same but more progressive. The Democrats aren't the same as the Greens, only more practical. That's what they'd like you to believe.
Right.
But in fact, we don't fit into that scale. And so when people talk about, well, I think I better vote for the Democrat because either a Democrat or Republican is going to win, and so I'm going to go with the pragmatic choice, my response to that is, unless you're voting for the changes you want to have happen, it's not rational to think that those changes are ever going to take place. Because we're a democracy. The only tool of self-government is the ballot box. If you can have your vote, in effect, bullied away from you by fear, vote for Hillary or you get Trump, then you are never going to be able to actually practice self-government. And it's interesting, if you go back and look at history, historically the way change happens is not by incrementally working from inside the system. It's by challenging the system. It's by going out into the street. It's by casting your vote for what you really believe and forcing politicians to pay attention. And you can't do that unless you're willing to cast an honest vote for what you honestly believe. That's self-government. That's what we're about.
Okay. So, Sydney, what we'll do is we'll just take a quick break right here, and when we get back, how about we jump into the core issues, to the actual, say, hot button topics that people use as those catchphrases and those hot button words that always gets people riled up. So those who don't know where the Green Party stand, we can make it clear for them.
Absolutely, I'm looking forward to it.
All right, thank you. We'll be right back on In My Humble Opinion with Sydney Smith of the Green Party of Virginia. As we jump into these core political issues that that at least the media tries to tell us anyway, this is what the black community cares about. This is what the evangelicals care about. Those kind of things. Leading into that, the actual process of the vote, because we've been talking about how you can follow the money trail a lot to figure out who's with who.
That's always your best bet. Right. Follow the money.
And so let me just ask your stance on the Electoral College and the fact that money has to be raised to even be considered, for the federal election. That's
right. And so one of the core items in our platform when it comes to electoral politics is public financing of campaigns. And a big issue for us this time around is actually giving the American people an opportunity to hear the full range of options. As you pointed out, most people aren't aware that there are other options, and it's because you look at the debates and who's in the debates, the Democrat and the Republican, right? And they set a very unrealistic bar of making 15% in popular polling before they'll allow another candidate in. And it's very simple why that is. The Democrats and the Republicans together run this election commission. It's their baby. They're the ones who get to call the shots, so of course they do it to benefit themselves. The actual criterion ought to be a very simple one. Is a candidate on the ballot in enough states to win the Electoral College? If they are, because that's how you become president, right? You win the Electoral College. If they are, they ought to be in the debates. And right now there are 4 people who qualify: Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party, and Jill Stein of the Green Party. There ought to be those 4 candidates up in front of the American people explaining what they think ought to be the right way forward for this country.
So to make that happen, then, do you think that it's mainly a grassroots effort, or do you feel like that the bottom line is getting more funding, getting more support?
One of our core values, and in fact, we express what the Green Party is about in 2 ways. One is in what we call the 4 pillars, and another one is what's called the 10 key values. Now, the Green Party actually is a global movement. So there's Green parties in Europe, there's a Green Party in Australia. A Green president was just elected in Austria. So it's a global thing, and the 4 pillars really comes out of the European Green Party, and it's social justice and ecological wisdom, nonviolence, and grassroots democracy. And grassroots democracy is one of the most important principles for us, because we don't think that it's right that the heirs to Walmart's fortune, right? That the big bankers who are making money out of predatory lending should have a megaphone in politics while the rest of us are silenced. That's not the way democracy should work. In fact, that doesn't even make sense when you think about what democracy is. So public financing of campaigns, getting rid of Citizens United, getting big corporate and big union money out of the electoral process, and making sure that the people's airwaves are used to really allow them to become informed and educated about the issues that affect their lives and what the candidates they have the opportunity to vote for are going to do about those issues. That's how we get it done.
Yeah. Now, you realize that that's gets called, not democracy. That's actually socialism, communism. Is that something that you embrace as a party, or
no?
What's the rebuttal to when people throw out those,
Well,
terms?
first of all, the public financing of campaigns has nothing to do with socialism or communism, right? Saying that rich people shouldn't run things doesn't make you a communist or a socialist. It just makes you a small d Democrat, right? Jeffersonian democracy. Socialism and communism are words that are much misused. So let me just very briefly. Socialism is an economic theory. And it says that people who are engaged in a productive enterprise, building things in a factory, working in a radio station, whatever it might be, the people who are actually doing that should be vested with ownership in that enterprise. They should be people who also own it, right? So that's socialism, the economic theory. Communism is the political theory that says that we should plan our economy and plan our political structure so as to force that to happen. The Green Party doesn't embrace communism at all. And the reason is because communism inevitably becomes a way of controlling people. It turns into totalitarianism. It's not that it's a nice theory in when you listen to it, from everyone according to their ability to everyone according to their need. Sounds like paradise. But the fact is, human economy and human affairs are simply too complex to be reduced to some stick figure game where you can decide what everybody gets. And when you try to reduce it to that, the inevitable result is a mess, right? Now, as for socialist economic ideology, some of that is something that we support. We support worker ownership. We support democracy in the workplace. That's not to say that we're communists or that we think that that people shouldn't be able to own their businesses or decide for themselves what they want to do with their lives. It just says that democracy ought to be as important a value in the economic sphere as it is in the political sphere, because people should be in control of their own lives. Right? That's what freedom and liberty are. We do have, and this is a big conversation going on in the Green Party right now, we are finally coming around to rejecting big C capitalism. And there's a reason for that. Capitalism is, as it's been practiced since the 14th century when it was created in Europe, capitalism is predicated on exploiting resources to cause a growth in monetized value. So it's predicated on continual growth, and it's predicated on exploitation of resources. And there are two very, very important problems here. One is we don't live on an infinite planet. We live on a finite planet. And when you have a finite situation and you introduce unlimited growth, we have a word for that. We call it cancer. It kills the host, right? And the other problem is when you're exploiting resources, well, what happens when you run out of resources? And we are running out of resources. We are up against a crisis of consumption that is destroying the planet. Our wildlife has declined. Our ecological foundation for human civilization has declined by 50% in our lifetimes. That's a huge crisis. I mean, that's an extinction level event if it continues. We can't keep doing that. So we've got to move away from that kind of capitalist ideology toward a new economy based on one of our four pillars, which is ecological wisdom. How do we build an economy that is sustainable, that is a steady state economy that allows us to build the kind of world we want to live in and then pass it along to our children, and they can pass it to theirs, and they can pass it to theirs in perpetuity. That's our responsibility as human beings.
And now, with those ideals, have you seen any clash when it comes to the religious front? Are you embraced by any of the denominations, or how does that part work? Because a lot of times you'll see that conflict, which personally I don't see it as a conflict, but some kind of put science versus religion.
We have a very diverse party in many respects, and one of our 10 key values is respect for diversity, and that doesn't just mean racial diversity or economic diversity. That also means cultural and religious diversity. So we have within the Green Party atheists, Christians, Muslims, Jews. Jill Stein is Jewish. I'm a Catholic. I have many atheist friends in the party. We really value bringing together all faith traditions and all belief systems and having them hash out together what it is that we hold in common in value, and really promoting that and really holding on to that. Okay. So no, there's no conflict. And as for religion versus scientists, as I said, I'm a Catholic. I'm also a PhD mathematician. I'm trained in the sciences, and I find no contradiction whatsoever. Good, so good. Yeah, I'm fine.
All right, so we've been treading a little bit, but how about we go ahead into the deep end?
Yeah, you bet.
So, first one I'm going to say, since it starts with the A, abortion. When that word comes up in a Green Party debate, what's the stance?
So the Green Party is a pro-choice party. And as you can imagine, for those of us in the party who are Catholic, we have some issues because I consent to the teaching of my church, something that you can only know through faith, which is that an unborn child is still a human being. And so it's interesting, though, the question here is really by people who are on either side of this issue, they really talk about different questions. People on the pro-life side are talking about the value and sacredness of human life, which is an important thing to talk about. People on the pro-choice side are talking about what actually happens in society when we structure laws around this issue, and what about a woman's sovereignty over her own body. Now I'll tell you a very personal story that really sorted this out for me. Okay. When I was a much younger man, and my wife and I wanted to have a child, and she got pregnant, so this was entirely on purpose. And I forget how many months pregnant she was, but I was probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 weeks. And she started to bleed, and we went to the doctor, and the doctor said, this fetus isn't developing properly. It is going to abort, and here are your choices. You can wait for it to happen, or we can take care of it right now. If you wait for it to happen, there's a risk that you could be in trouble. You could suddenly start bleeding. You could be damaged in a way that might make it difficult to have more children. There was no question of, are we going to have this child or not have this child? We weren't going to have that child. That was the medical fact. The question was, what do we do about it? And in the event, she had a D&C. That's what an abortion is, dilation and I forget what curtilage or something. And we got pregnant again, and my son is just got accepted to Fordham University Law School. So it's a happy ending, right? Awesome. Now here's the thing. Do I want the government in that waiting room with me and my wife, second guessing what that doctor is telling us and threatening anybody in that room with jail if they make the wrong decision? Or is this really not an appropriate place for the government to be? Right. I value human life, and I value unborn human life. But the question for me is, what is the correct role of government? Right. And interestingly, in those places where women have the full range of reproductive choices available to them, and including all the health care and child support and prenatal and postnatal and everything they need, the number of abortions goes down, and the number of unwanted pregnancies goes down. All right. And if we value human life, that's the outcome we're looking for, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm very comfortable with the Green Party, and I think the Green Party has taken the right position on this. That we need to keep the government out of that medical waiting room and give women sovereignty over their own bodies. It's a moral choice, but it's one they're going to have to make.
But then that leads us into the topic, because I will say once again, like I've said before, that I do not believe in wasting your right to vote. I feel like that you just have to draw yourself to whatever issues you are most magnetized to and vote based on that. I feel like that there's too much that has gone into us obtaining that right and keeping that right, and I feel like there's still power in that right to vote. Now, we do have Green Party and Libertarian options. Many people would say that that's a waste of your vote, and that pulls votes away from a particular candidate. Now, I feel like there's major reform that needs to happen, within our voting system. One being the Electoral College is something that is outdated. The way that system works. The way that how the popular vote can be overridden. Which I may say, my first presidential election, that I was old enough to participate in was the 2000 election.
Right.
A lot of people may remember that Mr. Al Gore won the popular vote. So that's how I brought in my adulthood. Right? And then this year, we find that, that the Democratic chair, they found voicemails and emails of her fussing and condemning people because they were giving attention to Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders was getting the majority of the popular support, and she was trying to run a machine. She was not trying to run a political party of the people. She was running a commercial machine, and when that came to light, I think that did major damage.
Now, let me ask you, we could do a little back and forth on this. Now, if you were a Bernie supporter and you saw that information, which basically is showing that your guy never had a shot in the first place. Basically, that's what that's saying. That should wake up every person that looks at this process and says, I don't believe anything that anybody's saying at any point in time.
Right.
Because I mean, you literally just remove. This isn't some person. This isn't Aaron Simmons walking into the studio or walking into that and saying, "Hey, look, yeah, we got some emails." They're like, "Man, go sit down. Whatever. You ain't got nothing." This is somebody that's in power, has a lot of resources, and for somehow this information got leaked. How did it get leaked? The people in charge. I would just say you need to start raising eyebrows and asking a lot of questions about this process. I would even go back, and I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I've heard a lot of people say this, is that I think Mr. Obama's presidency was planned. I think he was targeted to possibly be a minority candidate. And you listen to this information that's coming forward now, you can even look at Miss Clinton. Was planned. I just don't think that the people that are in control are in charge. All of a sudden, we just arbitrarily just let things happen. Right. This guy's going to come in and totally mess things up.
Right. Now, I heard you mention, the back and forth here. So let me throw one back at you, which is, what is your opinion, and when do you feel that glass ceiling gets broken, from when you start off as a young person that has a fervent spirit about making change within your community and the way that the world operates? You're volunteering everywhere, you're going to school for political science and all this stuff, and you're just all about the people. You're a man of the people. You're in the communities, right? And then what level of because it seems to be a pretty popular notion, what level of politics do people get at to when you're now corrupted? Because I hear people talking about this system. And so if it's a system, that means no matter how great or how much integrity President Obama had, there was some point that he had to get to where he couldn't do any more because of the system.
Right. I think that his whole presidency was evident. I think that just looking at him and using him as a victim example, you look at his presidency in the 8 years, and I want him to hurry up and get out of office, because I'm just tired of him being a scapegoat for 90% of the stuff he has no control over. I mean, what does he if we do research on how Congress and Senate works,
right,
knowing that half the stuff that goes into play or gets voted on, he signs off after other people vote on it.
Right.
And he hasn't used from my understanding, he hasn't used a tremendous amount of executive orders to overrule things. So
he hasn't. But on the flip side, Bush and Cheney actually did.
A ton. So he's not in charge. And I think that's, specifically for our community, he's not in charge. And the people that are in charge are always going to be in charge. And it's evident. I'm just not sure, going back to your original question, the truth stands whether it's now or forever. The truth is the truth. And I think you get corrupted when you stop telling the truth. And I just think that even politicians that mean well know that they're not even telling the whole truth, because they know that the system is rigged against a specific demographic or a specific group of people. They're doing the best that they can in these positions, but I think it's up to people to make themselves more knowledgeable about the system, and you just have realistic expectations, man. I think that's the only way you manage it. And everybody, we just do the best we can, but everybody has to have proper expectations about what's going on, how this thing is working, and realizing, everybody says, well, what happens if Donald Trump will get in office? Well, look what just happened. Has anybody seen the last 8 years when Barack was here? Can anybody remember the 8 before Mr. Bush was in there? We didn't have great things happening for the African American community in those times either. You know, everybody says the Clinton years were great. Well, yeah, you might have had differences in wealth, but that's when you had a huge majority of African American males being incarcerated. Then we go to Reagan and Bush. We had brothers killing each other, the crack epidemic and things like that. So we had so I need people to provide evidence of, okay, well, you show me that president that did a great job, and let's go back to that time. I haven't seen it yet. I could be wrong.
Well, the only thing I would interject is that, I do disagree with people when they say with President Obama, what he hasn't done anything. What has he done? Because I feel like he does have a record of some good things that he has been able to get past.
Every president has
some good things.
I think every president has good or bad. And I think that everyone forgets that this brother, like, basically, he walked into a puddle on the floor, and then everybody's like, okay, sweep, clean it up, and then all of a sudden he created an ocean. Well, it was an ocean really when he got there. It was a total mess, man, and a lot of us forget just the damage that comes. It's all these people have to clean up each other's messes, and I just believe he was a scapegoat. I always tell people about Obama, dude. I commend him for his integrity and just the way he carries himself in the office, because we talked about this the other day. That brother got in there, his hair was dark like yours, man. That sucker is it's great because that job and just the abuse he has taken, man. So it's just real hard, man. But we shall see what happens, man. We shall see.
So do you have any takeaways in any memorable moments, things that stuck with you from the RNC or the DNC? But let me throw one at you first, because it's hot on my mind. The one that threw me, and it has for a while, is the way so many try to separate church and state, but then to get certain voters, they'll blend them again. And I'm pretty sure you come from a family that has ministers in it, right? Did I hear you? Okay.
Yes, my father. Yes.
Right, and so is mine. And so, I've luckily, I feel like that my father has, been balanced with this. Like, he's not a religious fanatic. He's about the people and realize that government is supposed to govern its people regardless of your religion, right? Or your belief set. So in saying that, one thing that stuck out to me is, I don't know if you remember, but the RNC, and also at a previous dinner that they had, there's this one pastor, and he is the owner of one of the Christian broadcast stations. I want to say it's called Now or something like that. But
okay, I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah,
okay.
But this brother, was pretty much saying prayers, saying that Democrats are the devil, like they're the enemy of God. I mean, this is what this brother said. Black preacher too.
Yeah. Hey man.
He's saying Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a messenger. He was sent. And all. And this was his brother saying, right? And then on the flip side, on the DNC side, which I must say I rock a little more with this preacher, but then he was pointing out a lot of controversial issues that a lot of people know to be true, which is he even started getting into how Mr. Trump shouldn't be discriminating against certain people and ethnicities and whatnot, trying to block him from getting in this country because Jesus himself, is of African descent and things like that. So that shows you, what I mean, that contrast there. But, that's one of the things that really stood out to me, is how we can try to separate them at times, but then use them to our advantage. Even though I will say I feel like one side was speaking truth. But anything stood out to you?
Yeah, I think the one thing that stood out to me was, and I try not to watch a lot of television, but I did catch the clip to where, I don't know if he was a congressman or a senator, and he was sitting up there on that panel, and he made this comment of how no other subgroups have contributed more than the Western
Europeans, right?
Western European civilization. I don't want to take his information out of text. And then that lady had said, the black female had said, "You talking about white people?" And then they saved them. But I'm just saying, and I'm like, this is national television. Somebody elected him, like he was elected. Like so I'm saying he represents me. And then just that simple comment, it's not even to get a go back and forth, but I always like to just point stuff out, like, that's what they think of you, man. Like, when they start making comments, that's how they think of you. And I'm sitting there, he's saying that with a very diverse crew of people sitting there, and everybody starts looking at this guy like, You know, is he crazy? So, you know, just pay attention. You don't always have to get angry and upset, but you just have to be aware. One other thing that I saw was the whole controversy about Mrs. Trump's speech,
right,
and things of that nature. And literally, I just think a lot of that stuff is just a distraction.
For sure.
It's just a distraction to keep you from really thinking and using your brain from the real issue. It sounded verbatim. Then they put out the foolishness the next day of how somebody took, basically, look, they said, look, you're going to take this, you're going to fall on this knife tomorrow because nobody else is willing to take it. I wrote the speech and, you know, I'm sorry and I've resigned. I mean, it's just this foolishness.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how they have just literally turned this into a joke, but it's a serious joke. Right.
Yeah. And you're totally right about the distraction.
It's a serious joke. Yeah.
I saw one report that said, like that. Wow, you're being distracted by Mrs. Trump. In other news, the water in Flint is still dirty. You know what I mean? So, and speaking of which, we do have a gentleman from Virginia Tech, that we've been airing. That's part of the research team over in Flint, Michigan. So that's something that we're definitely going to keep y'all posted on and in tune to.
You gotta keep your head up.
So next, let me ask you about. I try to blanket it by saying social services. As far as where is that stance when it comes to pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, or if you need help, there should be tax money for whatever the social service. Whether you say it is welfare or what have you.
So the Green Party platform, very briefly, is first of all that we should get rid of unemployment offices and replace them with employment offices. There shouldn't be any such thing as somebody who wants to work and can't because there isn't anything available for them. There is so much that needs to be done in our country. We need to rebuild roads. We need to rebuild our energy infrastructure. We need to get away from fossil fuels and go to renewables. Jill Stein calls it a Green New Deal. And what it means is putting 20 million people to work getting us off fossil fuels by 2030, to put a halt to climate change, and to put this country back on the track to being a positive, developed, clean, economically dynamic country like it used to be. We also believe strongly that our social contract ought to include everyone. And one of the unfortunate features of traditional capitalism is it requires that part of the workforce be idled. It requires unemployment in order to function, because if nobody's unemployed, if everybody's happy with their job, then you can no longer exploit labor. And capitalism requires you to be able to exploit labor in that way. Okay. So part of moving away from that kind of a structure is saying the social contract needs to include everyone. Nobody should worry about where their next meal is coming from, whether they got a roof over their head, what they're going to do if they get sick, how they're going to get educated. So some specifics: a guaranteed basic income. And this is something that people have been talking about all over the world. It's being tried in some places. It's not a new idea. It's been around a long time. Nixon even toyed with it in the early 70s. It was at that time it was called a negative income tax. Okay. Right? It would replace all these means-tested things like food stamps and so on, where the government gets into your lives and say, do you really need this? Do you really deserve this? The fact of the matter is, just being a human being in this society means you deserve to be taken care of. So everybody would get the same. We'd do away with all that stuff that stigmatizes people because they haven't somehow achieved the American dream. Of course, free education, K through college. We already have K through 12. There's no reason we can't have K through college. And getting rid of student debt. If we can spend $1.5 trillion on a stupid jet we don't need that doesn't work, we can spend that money on 20 years of free college for everybody and eliminating all student debt. Use quantitative easing, just like we got the big banks out of trouble over their mortgage bubble that they created. We can do exactly the same thing over the student debt bubble that they also created. Just quantitative easing and get rid of it right now. Okay. That would provide a stimulus to the demand side of the economy and give a whole generation of young people an opportunity to participate in the economy, which right now they're all carrying around this big ball and chain that's stopping them from progressing in their lives. So those are some of the particulars, but you get the idea.
Yeah. And I definitely want to bookmark the energy. I heard you mention some of that. But yeah, and you answered the question before I got to it about the education, so it's pretty clear where the stance is. But now the two kind of play together, because what would you say about those who say, that is one welfare versus others, either corporate welfare or social welfare, and to provide, I guess for the education piece is is education a right? Is that what I'm hearing? Education of all people is a right. Is that why that's the stance?
Well, so let me address those two things in order. Let me come back to the education as a right. Corporate welfare versus social welfare. You know, since the first Clinton presidency back in the 90s, we've had a whole lot of one and not much of the other, right? Our social welfare is minuscule compared to most developed countries, and we give away hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to the big corporations, to the ADMs and Cargills and Exxon Mobils, and especially to the defense industry. I mean, that's $1 trillion giveaway every year to build weapons we don't need. So, yeah, we need to get rid of the corporate welfare and start taking care of people, right? Okay. I mean, that's what our government should be doing. It's supposed to be our government. It should be taking care of us and not Lockheed Martin, right? Yeah, now, the other issue, education as a right. You know, clear back in the 1780s, Thomas Jefferson introduced a bill called the Dissemination of Knowledge Bill. Back at that time, there was no such thing as public education, and it was his effort to get it started. And his reasoning was this. The idea of democracy is that we should govern ourselves. That's a good idea. I think we all agree on that. But if you're going to govern yourself well, if society is going to govern itself well, then it needs a populace that understands the issues. It needs a populace that knows what's going on. In other words, education, from my point of view, isn't so much a question of, you know, do you have a right to it? My question is, how could we ever possibly think we could do without it and still have a democracy? Because how do people govern themselves if they're ignorant? You have to have an education in order to be able to make sound decisions for yourself, for your community, for your family. And in our world, it's, you know, back when public education first started, it was pretty much through 8th grade. Then it was through 12th grade. Well, let's face it, the world has progressed to a point where in order for you to have a complete education, as much as a person probably really wants, we need to be providing that opportunity right up through a bachelor's degree.
What's the Green Party's response as far as what's happening in the recent events and news as far as police brutality and different things like that?
We take a very strong stance. We're very strong supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement. We call for a number of steps to put an end to this. We really need to see an end to the police brutality. So number one, police departments have to be held accountable, and we cannot expect them to hold themselves to account, nor can we expect prosecutors in those communities to hold them to account, because the police and the prosecutors are part of the same justice system. They cannot hold a check on one another. So in any case where someone dies in police custody or there's a question about the use of police violence, there should be an independent investigation and, depending upon what the investigation reveals, an independent prosecution to ensure that the police departments are held to account. What's been happening to people of color throughout our history continues to be a national scandal, and the fact that this is still happening, that as we saw just a week or two ago, that a black man can be lying down his back in the street with his arms in the air saying, "I don't have a gun, don't shoot me," and he gets shot. I mean, it's beyond anything that anybody should be willing to tolerate. So that's a first step. Of course, demilitarizing the police. You know, back when I was a kid, police were just part of the community, right? I mean, they were us and we were them, and that's how it's supposed to be. But with the militarization of the police that's been going on the last several decades, the attitude in the police department is it's us and them. That they're a military and we're the thing being, we're the enemy. And that's absolutely wrong-headed way to run a society. Police need to be embedded in their communities. They should be armed minimally, and they should not ever have this kind of militarized, panic-stricken. I mean, we're in a situation now where police are allowed to panic and start firing, and civilians are required to hold their cool when they've got a gun in their face. Right, and it's supposed to be the other way around. They're supposed to be the professionals, right? They're the ones who are supposed to be able to establish calm and do things safely. And as we see in other parts of the world, that's how it works, right? Yeah, this kind of thing happens in Europe, and people don't get shot; they get arrested and very often taken to the hospital because usually they're nuts, right? Here in the United States, the police just start shooting, and the culture of fear and of militarization has got to be stopped.
And now, speaking of which, crime. When I mention crime, particularly the decriminalization of certain drugs, whether it be marijuana, etc. and as well as the prison system and how that flow works. Public versus private prisons. So in crime in general.
So our position on drugs is that the drug war is essentially a war on minorities. Always has been. And in fact, if you go back to the Nixon era when they started it, it was explicit. They were talking about it. All those things that used to be secret, those secrets are out now. We know what they were talking about. It was a way of controlling leftists and blacks. That was why the war on drugs was created, and that's been the effect, hasn't it, especially for the black community. So the war on drugs needs to be ended. Drug addiction is not a crime. Drug use is not a crime. It's your body, and the correct way to handle drug abuse and drugs in society is the way that, for example, Portugal has done it, and many other areas in the world. You decriminalize, you treat addiction as a public health problem, and you treat it as such. And when that happens, guess what? Drug use goes down, and the gangs disappear, and the whole drug cartel vanishes like mist in the morning, because it was all created by the drug war to begin with. Now, regarding the justice, so-called justice system,
In the prisons.
I always think of a young man named, what's his name, Khalif Browder. I'm sure some of your listeners might know about him. He was a young man who was 16 in New York City when he was arrested and accused of stealing a backpack. They never actually had a case against him, but what happened to him was he spent 3 years on Rikers Island, a whole lot of it in solitary confinement, while the justice system just went whizzing on around him. And his life was destroyed, and ultimately, long after he was released, he committed suicide. Now, it would be one thing if this was an exceptional tragedy, but it's not. It's a common occurrence. We have only, if you take all the people in the world, only 1 out of 20 is an American. But if you take all the prisoners in the world, 1 out of 4 is in an American prison or jail cell. We incarcerate people at a rate 5 times that of the civilized world, and it falls very disproportionately on people of color. It's an unforgivable sin for the society to be doing this. Locking people up for profit. And I'm sorry to say Hillary Clinton, is right in the thick of that, right? People working for her campaign, people she's worked with in her professional life, the private prison system. In a just and mature society, you don't run the justice system for profit. You don't have police officers stealing from people on the highway like they've been doing all across the country, and you don't have people getting locked up to line somebody else's pockets. You just don't do that. So all nonviolent offenders should be released at once.
Okay.
And we should reform the justice system so that it really is a justice system and not an injustice system.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've been hearing our conversations with Mr. Sidney Smith of the Virginia Green Party, and he is as well a delegate for the Green Party for Virginia. And so, Mr. Smith, thank you again.
Let me just mention for people who want to know more, please go to gp.org for the National Green Party of the United States, to jill2016.com to learn more about our presidential candidate, Jill Stein. And if you live here in Virginia, please think about getting involved. You can go to vagreenparty.org, which is our state website. There's an opportunity there for you to sign up. The Green Party is not a top-down party, it's a bottom-up party. Remember, grassroots democracy is one of our 4 pillars. And so the Green Party of the United States is really a federation of state parties and identity caucuses, including Black Caucus, Latinx Caucus, Youth Caucus. And the state parties themselves are federations of their local parties, people involved in their local communities and doing things like running for school board. So please find out more and think about getting involved in your local, because that's how we build the party and that's how we build our future.
Mr. Smith, thank you, and hopefully we can chat with you again soon.
Thank you very much for the offer.
All right, thanks for joining In My Humble Opinion.